right, guys. So we're just going to give you a few seconds if you want to drop off and jump into track 2. Sean Stadikowski is doing current cyber threats. And our link was just put into the chat, or you can go to ahc2021.com to find that link pretty easily. And hey, Dana, just doing a quick audio check on you.
Hey, how you doing, Laura? Have you got any audio?
Audio's good. Rob, how are you? Let's see, Rob, we need to get you unmuted and camera on.
I'm doing okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Do you want to come camera on, or are you going to stay shy?
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Okay. Okay, just a reminder to our listeners, you're still in track 1. We're going to head into using DHS ESF 14 for private sector coordination. Okay, I can see Molly put her contact information in the chat, so be sure to check that. There you are, Rob.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm so pleased to introduce our next speakers. We did a webinar with them as well on ESF 14. I'm so glad you can come back and talk a little bit about that to our listeners today. We have Rob Glenn, the Director of Office of Business Industry and Infrastructure Integration for FEMA, and Dana Ahrens, Emergency Response Operation Branch with DHS CISA. Guys?
Hey, thanks, Laura. Hey, everyone, this is Dana. Rob and I are going to tag team this brief today, be bouncing back and forth. Also on the line is Bob Rutledge, who some of you may know, who is the ESF 14 Deputy PMO within CISA. So good afternoon. Really appreciate you taking the time and helping Laura get her numbers up in her competition with Tom about who's going to have the larger outbreak session. I can't emphasize enough the importance of our relationship with All Hazards Consortium and the work that we're going to be doing with them moving forward. So a very special relationship that we're looking to build and continue further. Earlier today, you heard a keynote address from at 12:40 from Assistant Director for Integrated Operations Division within CISA, Mr. Rick Driggers, and he briefed on ESF 2 as well as on ESF 14. He touched on those. And we're going to elaborate further on ESF 14 today. I'm going to get us started off here. You'll see our first slide here. ESF 14, you know, it's an interesting case. It's actually been around for some time. Rob and I have been working this issue together for a couple of years, but it just formally was established in October 2019. So it's about a year and a half or so old. And that was due to the release of the National Response Framework that came out. And what we identified, and a lot of this came out of the 2017 hurricane season, what we identified was that there was really a place to try and work more closely to identify any potential opportunities to enhance the mitigation to response and recovery efforts, and to do that through greater public and private partnerships and cross-sector coordination. And so the two natural entities that come into play on that become CISA and FEMA, where we are the two primary agencies supporting this function. CISA has lead, but Rob and I work in close partnership on this issue, both in steady state and in activation. We work with all of the ESFs that are out there. CISA has lead on ESF 2 and 14, but we work with all of them. And we work with a variety of infrastructure owners, operators, and other government entities. You'll see some of the primary partner agencies, their logos listed across the bottom of the slide there. And that's not to say that they're the only ones we work with, but those are the named primary partner agencies that we work with, most of whom are represented within the ESF structure within FEMA, the emergency support function structure within FEMA. And the ultimate goal really is just to try and prevent or mitigate cascading failures across multiple sectors, and really to build bridges as well for communications across those sectors. Persia did a nice job just a minute ago identifying synergies that can be gained. And she talked about Walmart and Verizon sitting next to each other. Well, we have some of those same functions as well when we go with 14 at the national level, and we can start to help enable and provide some of those linkages. So it's always a good, great pleasure hearing Persia brief. Her enthusiasm is absolutely amazing if you haven't had a chance to work with her before. But working those issues at the national level as well, and working with the various BEOCs and state entities is an essential part of what we do, as well as working with the various sectors and how we can maximize that. And usually that's done through professional associations and groups such as All Has a Consortium, where we can bring multiple entities together in a single group to help share information and pass information back and forth. It's also important to note ESF 14, we work in concert with the other ESFs. We are not an overarching super ESF that oversees their actions. If you contact us and you have got an issue that is a communications issue, we will hand you off positively to ESF 2 and let you work communications issues, or we'll hand you off if it's an energy issue over to ESF 12. Usually with Ken Buell with Department of Energy and work the issue there, or with some of our private sector partners on that side. So we are proactively making sure folks are in the right place. And if it happens to be a gap, or if it happens to represent a cascading failure across multiple ESFs, that's where Rob and I move in and really work to try and coordinate that. And I think part of the key message there, and this has been talked about, this was talked about both by Molly and by Persia. And frankly, prior to that, it was talked about by Monica and Abby as well. But that information sharing, quality of information, value of the information, and assessing that value, but building those partnerships and that communication to make that a two-way street, us providing information to our sector partners, our partners providing information back out to us to help drive operations. It does exactly that. It really gives our partners an opportunity to help drive operations, and that's incredibly important. Everyone's got a Hurricane Maria story. Rob and I were down in Puerto Rico together working the hurricane. And one of the issues that came up down there as an example was a focus on trying to get the pharmaceutical industry back up and running. We knew that wastewater was a key element. It was something that was actively being worked. But when the pharma industry could stand up and point at a very specific water and wastewater treatment facility and identify that they can't operate if that facility is not up and going, well, that starts to help build out those cascading impacts that we may not naturally see. And so it enables us to really help drive our operations faster to make sure that our partners are getting businesses up and open and operating again. And again, it all comes down to those lifelines, to those life-saving, life-sustaining operations. Persia's example about getting communications back up to Walmart. It's not because we own stock in Walmart. It's because they provide those life-saving commodities, and we want to get those businesses, as many as we can, up and open again, so that folks can get out and get their food, get the things they need in a disaster situation. It's also important to note that we work pre-disaster, we work response during a disaster, and then we also work post-disaster as well. And so we're at all stages of the process. Probably the last thing then I'll touch on just on this slide is there's a couple of primary ways to get a hold of us and to communicate with us. One way is to reach out through our ESF 14 email address, and I'll post that at the end of this conversation into our chat. And the other is through the MBEOC portal, and many of you probably already are aware of that. And then working through that portal as well to bring issues up to our attention. Now, could we go to the next slide, please? So again, I mentioned before, this is where Rob and I really start to kind of tag team. I mentioned before how we operate in steady state. We want to make sure that folks understand we're constantly operating. We don't just stand up when an emergency happens. And so we're always operating, always building our partnerships, always coordinating and working with our partners to make sure we have a solid understanding of needs and requirements. And so on the ESF 14 side, we emphasize more on the critical infrastructure and national critical functions. On Rob's side, he'll talk to this in a minute, is with the OB3I folks, it's really an emphasis on lifelines and critical supply chains, and the overlap between those two is obvious. And so it makes it a very good partnership for us to work in those areas. Both of us are focused on continuous outreach to public and private sector partners. And that's just a continuous process we work through as well. During an activation, especially when the NRCC activates, which it's what, Rob, been activated for over 300 days now this year. It was very interesting hearing Molly and Abby talk about fatigue and kind of managing fatigue as folks are operating at such a high state for such a sustained period of time, and how they work through those issues. And I can say for Rob and I, on our end, one of the ways we do that is by building out these partnerships even further. So we're sharing workload with our partners, trying to improve communications flows and understanding and driving operations. But during an activation, OB3I and the ESF 14 PMO office come together under FEMA's NRCC and function as straight up ESF 14. There's a number of activities that we do. You may or may not be aware, right now we are running 2 calls a week regarding COVID vaccine operations. We're running those on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's an open call, and for folks, we can post that information in the chat after. That's an open call that anyone can join in, and we push and present information that will just give you a better understanding of where we're at and what's going on. We try to create an opportunity as well to receive information in that forum, but oftentimes the size of the audience is a little bit restrictive on that, and so we try to find other forums to bring some of that information back in. Depending on the disaster, sometimes those go daily. We conduct a number of different routine calls with groups just for information sharing and gathering, and then also working to identify our critical issues that might lead to those cascading failures. I mentioned the story about the wastewater treatment facility in Puerto Rico as an example. And then working really to coordinate key issues just between the sectors and the government in order to support the ESFs and the agencies as well as our private sector partners. We've had several cases of being able to coordinate and link up different private sector partners who had sympathetic problems and could help solve each other's problems, but maybe were just different industries and weren't necessarily operating, communicating or would know to communicate with each other. And COVID has certainly brought out some unique instances. I recall last summer we linked up a ethanol manufacturer who had an excess amount of alcohol on hand and was running out of storage, and we were able to link them up with an aviation-based industry who could use that alcohol as a sanitizer once it was diluted. And so creating some of those linkages and marriages is obviously part of what we do. Rob, I've been talking way too much here. Let me defer over to you just for a minute here.
Well, Dana, it's good to see that nothing's changed since we first started working together during 2017, Harvey, Irma, Maria. Hey, all kidding aside, when we looked at, just for a little bit of background, so when we looked at the challenge that Harvey, Irma, and Maria was presenting, we knew that we needed to do a better job from a federal government standpoint to, one, support state BEOC development and maturity. We also knew that we needed to provide a better cohesive experience for our private sector partners, whether they strongly affiliated with one of the 16 sectors or not. Our overall endeavor is to ensure that businesses, small, medium, and large, are getting the kind of assistance that they need. All disasters being local, we obviously want BEOCs in every single state, but we also know that there are different ways of organizing and supporting and working with the private sector. So one of the things that has come up a few different times in a few different forums is that ESF 14, for example, is kind of a mandate, an implied mandate at the state level, or even down to the community level. And really, if you look at ESF 14, the ESF is only one of the few, actually it's the only one that actually has outcomes written into it. It's a very outcome driven ESF that recognizes the supply chain and the economic security challenges that we face. And I think in 2017, we certainly saw that. And I think we've also seen it certainly from a COVID standpoint over the last year. Just by way of kind of fast forward, the National Response Coordination Center did activate at the highest level just a few days ago. And as Dana said, we're having calls Tuesdays and Thursdays right now. The NBEOC, is really focused on the incident and how we actually channel offers of assistance and support. One of the other aspects of ESF 14 is the National Risk Management Center that really helps us better understand what the potential interdependencies might be. What do we need to potentially be mindful from a planning standpoint? So ESF 14 brings, not just FEMA, CISA, but the interim C, NBEOC, and the 15 support agencies that we're building alliances with, and also getting to understand some of the capabilities across the federal government that can and should be of assistance to supporting state managed disasters that are locally executed.
Hey, thanks, Rob. You brought up some great points too. I would also articulate several of you may have relationships already with the National Council of ISACs, who we partner with. You may have relationships with the Cross-Sector Coordinating Council, whom you partner with. Very interesting point brought up in a previous briefing by both Persia and Molly was the fact of information sharing and how some of those partnerships work. So for those of you that are engaged with our sector engagement division within CISA, we have established formal partnerships, and we have formal ways of sharing information, in which case the information is very protected, as we're very mindful of proprietary information and sharing information with competitors. And so those are avenues and abilities that exist that we always want to promote. And so with that, I'll ask if we can go on to the last slide here. So we talk about different outcomes, and Rob just touched on this a minute ago. One of the outcomes, obviously, is that we work to try and encourage folks to adopt the community lifelines structure, which FEMA operates under. And this is really a philosophical way of thinking about the problems and going after. And it's a decision-making driver. It's not that we're trying to overly push this mantra. We will work with our partners in any way that they need us to work with them. We're not going to ask them always to change their operations, but it is a structure that has served us well for the last year or so. And we also work within the national response framework in order to help stabilize and optimize survivor access to those different businesses and those different services. And we've talked about that. We're also working hard on sequencing effective effort-based analysis for interdependencies. And that's across the state, local, tribal, territorial, and national benefits. So understanding really how these different entities or interdependencies exist, that's always an area that we start to work with. As everyone's well aware, professional associations stand up and they function oftentimes within that specific industry sector. And while you as business owners are well versed on what other industries you're tied into, some of them are obvious to us at the federal level, some of them may not be. And so we want to try and put processes in place in order to make sure that we mitigate any lack of understanding. And again, use information from the subject matter experts, which is often our partners, on their business operations in order to help drive operations at our level to make sure that what we're doing is meaningful, impactful, and kind of adopts the medical mantra of first do no harm. Also looking to make sure that we just mitigate those cascading failures that can happen across multiple sectors, which is what I really just talked about. And then just helping to drive greater comms and harmony with our private sector and public sector partners in order to make sure that as many folks as we can understand, the nature of the operations of what we're doing and how we're working, and then sharing that information back and forth. So those are really some of the desired outcomes. Rob, what did I miss?
Just a couple things that I would just share is that we want to make sure that there's no wrong door for coordination, right? So sometimes there's tension that we've had to work through, quite frankly, of the sector model, the sector-based approach, and the view of the national critical functions. Those are incredibly important ways of understanding the environment and structure. There's also the way of looking at the community lifelines, and the national response framework that was updated, in 2019, acknowledges that community lifelines help stabilize and then also help the fabric of the community recover faster if the faster they're stabilized. So there's kind of built-in tension into the system that I think is healthy. It's also, I think, important to note. I mean, I think it's great that we are following Mali and Persia, because we will support, certainly from an NBEOC and FEMA standpoint, those state level operations that if they need a contact, we will support that. If they need potentially insight to supply chain, if we're not looking at it and maybe they have a need to take a look at it, we provide that as well as support to the states and also to other jurisdictions below the state level. This is I think a national network that has been in existence for some time, but I think 14 is really I think the latest iteration of how that national network is sharing information, how we're more attuned to some of the risk, and then also how we can ensure that we are alleviating from a federal standpoint problems that can really destabilize supply chains, going all the way back to the source, whether it's overseas or whether it's domestically. And we're working through some of those issues right now from a COVID standpoint. So, Dana, I don't really have anything else to add, but I'm sure people probably have some questions.
Yep, I would agree. So I think that wraps it up nicely. So Laura, with that, we'll kick back over to you in case there's any questions that have come in. Otherwise, we realize we're the last brief of the day, and we'll happily yield back our remaining time.
Okay, Dina, Rob, thank you so much. We do have a question here from Michael. As members of a national public-private partnership, how can individual InfraGard chapters, IMAs, potentially contribute to achieving desired ESF 14 outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so was a member of InfraGard when I was at the state level. InfraGard's a great organization, and it really started, after, actually even before 9/11. InfraGard, the FBI and the Department of Justice are, really the federal sponsor for InfraGard. We're becoming better, I think, at making those connections across the departments and agencies at the federal level. We've seen InfraGard involved in sharing information, and bringing up points both on our broad stakeholder calls as well as within the NBEOC. But I would say that I think InfraGard is really valuable in providing input at the state level, particularly on cybersecurity issues. So I would just offer that up, and Dana, over to you, since you're part of the Cybersecurity Information Security Agency.
No, I think you wrapped that up really well, Rob. I don't think we need to elaborate on that anymore. That was a great answer. So we'll defer back to Laura.
Yeah, that's all the questions that we had in. So what would be your last minute bit of advice to our listeners today? Dana, let's start with you.
Yeah, so the last thing I would argue is, as much as possible, be patient. I hate to admit this, but unfortunately, Rob and I do not have the staffs and personnel that we wish we had. It's probably true of everybody, just in terms of numbers. We've got some real high quality folks that work with us, which is fantastic, but be patient. There's a lot of, especially as we're dealing with the current rollout of pandemic issues, there's a lot of synergy going on between the federal agencies as the NRCC has been activated. And so information is going to be, it's actively and aggressively being worked. It might be just a little bit slower in terms of the rollout, but please, 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 one of the big outcomes that we want to drive to is not just being in an information push mindset where we're constantly working to push information out to our sectors, but also being in an information pull mindset, or asking our partners to be in a push environment where you're anticipating potential issues, especially if they're cascading issues across sectors. But trying to anticipate what some of those problems may be and pushing those problems up to us proactively so we can examine those and work faster and quicker to try and mitigate those. So really relying on that partnership and those communications.
Rob, what would your answer be? What's your one bit of advice to our listeners?
Yeah, and I just saw that there was actually some, I don't know how the chat's really working, but there was a couple of questions that were related to just how we've kind of evolved and how to get plugged into the NBEOC. So, you know, communication and feedback is a gift, right? So I think the bit of advice that I would offer is you almost can't over communicate, but I think that you have to know when the communication is going to hit. So we are trying really hard to make sure that we are being timely with our communication, whether it's when we activate or even you know, what we potentially think we need from a planning standpoint. And you know, the other thing I would just say is, you know, when we changed the name of the private sector division at FEMA to the Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration, so I want to just end on integration. You know, it's one thing to engage industry and to talk a lot, which I think we do just naturally, but how do we integrate into planning, training, and exercises, and how to ultimately into operations is really where we can make the greatest impact for the communities that we're serving. So I would just leave it there, and that if anyone's interested in more about the NBEOC, NBEOC at max.gov is the best way to get a hold of us. And then if you're really interested in plugging in on the CISA side, you know, we would share that information back to Dana and the team over in the ESF 14 PMO. Thanks, Laura.
Okay. And if you could just spend, Rob, a few seconds on talking about the how the NBEOC has matured, how its objectives have matured over the years, or Dana.
Yeah, so you know, the NBEOC, you know, started in 2012 and was first tested in hurricanes or Superstorm Sandy, and it was really out of necessity because there was such an outpouring of support coming from industry. And while we do manage and coordinate and coalesce those offers of support now, I can just tell you that where we are now, we're very much focused on supporting state BOCs. We set operational objectives that we didn't when we first started. That's just a different posture than we were when we first started out. And I think that that's going to be the posture as we move forward, particularly within 2021, as the pandemic continues, and we're, as Dana will attest, you know, we're knee deep in how we can accelerate the vaccine support for where we are right now.
Okay, Rob, thank you so much. Dana, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for being here, and thanks for all of your hard work.
Thank
There's
you.
a lot of positive comments in the chat, and hopefully you have a minute to read them all.